Welcome everyone to the AMS 50 Economic Development and Land Use webinar series for the month of December. The topic for today is telecommuting in the pandemic era. The committee chairs include Noreen McDonald and Michael Lawrence, and these sessions are moderated by Professor Jason Kao and myself, Ilham Shikari. I'm a PhD student at Florida State. The committee scope focuses on the impacts of transportation on the economy, environment, and society. It is concerned with efficient, effective, and equitable transportation systems that promote competitive advantage, economic resiliency, and sustainability for our cities, regions, and societies. This committee provides a cross-cutting forum for practitioners and researchers to understand the interrelationship between transportation, economic development, and economy and land use, and the policies and management approaches required to create sustainable growth at national, regional, and local scales. In order to be aware of future events and webinars of the AMS 50 Economic Development and Land Use Committee, please log into TRB, go to committees, click on Become a Friend of a Committee, find the AMS 50, and click on Become a Friend. Throughout the webinar, please feel free to raise your questions, either type them in the chat section or raise your hand virtually and we will unmute you. The last webinar at a glance, the title was TODs in the Global South. Our speakers were Mr. Hamidur Rahman and Dr. Fenglong Wang, and you can check out the YouTube recording at our YouTube channel. You can search for the keywords TRB AMS 50. And with that, I will go ahead and introduce our first speaker. Dr. Riccardo Ceccato is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Padua. His research interests include travel behavior analysis, sustainable transportation system planning, traffic simulation, and logistics. He is currently working on the investigation of MaaS adoption and related impacts and the integration of innovative data sources to model travel behavior and simulate traffic flows. He holds a Ph.D. in civil and environmental engineering from the Polytechnic University of Turin, Italy, and a master's in civil engineering from the University of Padua in Italy. And the title is Potential Long-Term Effects of COVID-19 on Telecommuting and Environment, an Italian Case Study. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Ceccato, for your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you for your introduction. I will share my screen. Okay. So good morning or good afternoon to everyone. I'm honored to be here to present to you some insights from the research work that has been published with the title Potential Long-Term Effects of COVID-19 on Telecommuting and Environment, an Italian Case Study. Many previous works have shown that the sudden and widespread diffusion of COVID-19 has caused many changes in daily lives of citizens around the world, with the consequent impacts on travel habits. I want to show you the impacts that occurred in Italy in order to explain you why this case study could be considered interesting. In particular, the figures that I'm going to show you are based on a mobility survey that the National High Institute for Transportation, Education and Research carries out every year. In particular, the figure in this slide shows the mobility rate of Italian citizens in 2020. And as you can see, during the national lockdown, the percentage of people performing at least one trip in a working day decreased up to 20%. In Italy, the pandemic impacted not only the decision to travel, but also the modal share of performed trips. As you can see from the figure on the left, if we compare 2020 with the 2019, The modal share of active modes increased by 6%, and the number of public transportation trips halved. This trend for active modes was confirmed in 2021. However, public transportation did not reach the pre-pandemic levels. However, the most important impact was observed regarding the diffusion of work from home. As you can see from the figure on the right, telework was rarely adopted before the pandemic outbreak. In 2020, the number of people working from home drastically increased by around 1,000%. And this rate remained quite high even in 2021. In 2021, the National Institute collected information regarding the future willingness to change travel mode and to adopt telework. The results confirmed the trends that has been observed for 2020, and in addition, a potential increase in private car trips was found. So on the one hand, we observed an increase in private car trips and a parallel decrease in public transportation trips, which could lead to an increase in pollutant emissions. On the other hand, we observed a diffusion of work from home that reduces the number of commuting trips, thus reducing pollutant emissions. So the trade-off, so the aim of this research was to understand the trade-off between telecommuting and its environmental benefits in the context of COVID-19 pandemic. This trade-off has been the subject of many previous research works. However, what is new, at least in Italy, is the sudden and widespread diffusion of work from home that was induced by COVID-19. And in addition, the shift from public transportation to private vehicles could be a new rebound effect that could compensate the potential positive impacts of telecommuting on environment. This research work tried to answer the following research questions. How will COVID-19 influence the choice of telecommuting in the future? What will be the effects of telecommuting on the environment in a post-COVID era? And what will be the rebound effect due to COVID-19? In order to answer these research questions, a mobility survey was designed and administered to employees of the University of Padua, which is a medium-sized city in northern Italy, from July to September 2020. This targeted group was considered interesting for two main reasons. First, these employees have been experiencing telework for several months during and after the national lockdown. Therefore, they could understand the benefits and the drawbacks of this activity. In addition, at the time of the survey administration, they could really decide whether to work from home or not. The mobility survey was divided into 4 sections. Here, I will briefly summarize its contents, and further details can be found in the paper. In particular, after a brief introduction, some detailed questions regarding a typical working trip carried out in a typical working week before the pandemic outbreak were posed. Then some questions related to travel habits and the adoption of telework before the pandemic outbreak, during the national lockdown and after it were shown. Then respondents had to report their concern about the pandemic and their desired future weekly frequency of work from home. After that, they had to face with the stated preferences experiments, focusing on a future scenario in which they can freely decide whether to go to their office or not, and the virus is still diffused. In particular, they had to choose the travel mode that they were willing to adopt, assuming that they had to perform the same trip reported in the previous section of the survey. In order to evaluate the impacts of COVID-19 on telework and environment, the pollutant emissions generated by working trips performed before the pandemic outbreak were compared with those obtained for future scenarios. In both of the cases, input data were the number of working trips in a typical working week and the travel modes adopted to commute. However, for the pre-COVID scenario, these information were directly obtained from the revealed preferences part of the survey. And for future scenarios, we used the stated future number of work from home days and the results of the application of the estimated mode choice model. In order to estimate pollutant emissions, these information were integrated with the lengths of the trips and the characteristics of vehicles. In particular, two future scenarios were investigated, considering different sets of measures that could be implemented to contain the spread of the virus. Scenario A with no countermeasures on board vehicles, and scenario B with a set of measures that were identified by analyzing the results of the estimation phase of the mode choice model, and that could positively affect the adoption of sustainable travel modes to commute. Specifically, in this research work, three models were developed. The first model was used to understand the factors that could impact the future number of work from home days. The second model was used to identify factors that could impact the choice of the travel mode to commute and to forecast its adoption in the future. And the third model was used to estimate pollutant emissions generated by vehicles that were used to perform these working trips. In particular, a tank-to-wheel analysis was carried out. Therefore, only pollutants generated by tailpipe emissions were considered. We applied the Coppert model, which is developed by the European Environment Agency, and based on the emission factors that estimate the emission level for unit distance for each pollutant. Here I reported some of the main characteristics of the sample, and the analysis of these results confirmed what has been observed at the national level. In particular, the figure on the left shows the modal share of commuting trips before the pandemic outbreak, during the first national lockdown and after it. We observed an increase in private car trips, in particular from 30% before the pandemic outbreak to 52% during the national lockdown. We found a decrease in public transportation trips from 42% to 9% and then to 18% after the first national lockdown. And lastly, we observed an increase in active modes. The figure on the right shows the distribution of the number of work from home days in a week in the three considered periods. As you can see, telework was rarely adopted before the pandemic outbreak. As expected, during the first national lockdown, most of the respondents worked from home, and more than half of them decided to adopt this activity even when it was not mandatory. As regards the model evaluating the future number of work from home days in a week, we found that the frequency of telework could be impacted by factors related and non-related to the pandemic. Details can be found in the paper. However, we observed that people who frequently traveled on public transportation were more willing to work from home in the future. And this indicates that this kind of trips could be no longer carried out. As regards the results of the estimation phase of the mode choice model, we found that people who use the private car or private bike to commute were likely to adopt them even in the future. In addition, we observed that potential modal shifts could occur, in particular from public transportation to private car. Moreover, we found that the perception of the health risk of traveling could impact the adoption of public transportation, carpooling, and bike sharing, probably since in these cases travelers have to share the means or the trip with other passengers. And lastly, this model allowed us to identify some measures that could affect the adoption of specific travel modes. These figures shows the frequency of work from home day in a week for the pre-COVID period and in a future scenario. As you can see, the number of people never adopting telework drastically decreased from 90% before the pandemic outbreak to 5% in a future scenario. In particular, the results related to the future scenario pointed out that the number of commuting trips could be reduced. Specifically, as you can see, about 40% of the sample could decide not to telecommute in the future. The graphs in this slide represent the modal share of commuting trips for different trip lengths and for the considered periods. In particular, as you can see from the figure related to the pre-pandemic period, most of the trips shorter than 5 kilometers were carried out on sustainable travel modes that are represented by green lines and by bike in particular. Most of the trips with a length ranging from 5 to 30 kilometers were carried out on non-sustainable travel modes and car in particular. And for trips longer than 30 kilometers, we found that the modal share of sustainable travel modes returns to overcome that of non-sustainable travel modes. And this is due to the adoption of public transportation. This trend was not observed for future scenarios, where while most of the trips shorter than 5 kilometers were carried out on sustainable travel modes, for trips longer than 5 kilometers, the modal share of non-sustainable travel modes overcomes that of sustainable travel modes. And this is due to the lower adoption of public transportation if compared with the pre-pandemic period. This negative trend is mitigated in scenario B, where some countermeasures could foster the adoption of public transportation. In order to highlight the potential modal shifts from the pre-COVID period to future scenarios, we use the Sankey diagrams. Here you can see the graphs related to trips shorter than 5 kilometers that can be associated to an urban area. Both of the figures show the general inertia of bikers and car drivers in changing travel modes. Moreover, we observed that the bike could potentially attract both car drivers and public transportation users. And this could be due to the infrastructural interventions that the municipality of Padova carried out in order to increase the number and improve the safety of cycle paths. Lastly, we observed that many shifts from public transportation to private car could occur, in particular in scenario A, and this number is reduced in scenario B, where about half of the people who used public transportation in the pre-COVID period could adopt it even in the future. Here you can see the graphs related to trips with a length ranging from 30 to 50 kilometers. Both of the figures show that the car drivers have the strongest behavioral inertia. We observed that the number of public transportation trips could be reduced. In particular, more than half of the public transportation trips in the pre-COVID period could be carried out on private car in the future scenario A. And this number is reduced in scenario B. Lastly, we found that carpooling could potentially attract both car drivers and public transportation users. Here you can see the pollutant emissions estimated for commuting trips for the three considered periods. As you can see, the results pointed out that the new telecommuting habits and the new travel behaviors induced by COVID-19 could generate a net negative impact on environment. In particular, we found that even if the diffusion of telework reduced the number of commuting trips, those deciding to travel could adopt non-sustainable travel modes. And this new balance could not decrease pollutant emissions. In particular, as you can see from these three figures, the quantity of CO2, nitrogen oxides, and particulate matter could increase by about 1/3 in scenario A, and this percentage could be decreased up to 10% if some measures to foster the adoption of sustainable travel modes were implemented. So in this research work, potential environmental impacts of work from home and travel mode choice due to COVID-19 were estimated by using data collected from a mobility survey administered to employees of the University of Padua. We calibrated 3 models. The first model pointed out that COVID-19 could have a significant impact on the future frequency of work from home. The second model highlighted that biosecurity concerns could affect the adoption of sustainable travel modes, and that risk mitigation measures could impact the mode choice. In addition, we found that a rebound effect due to COVID-19 on the potential benefits of telecommuting on environment could occur. In particular, many shifts from public transportation towards private car could reverse the positive impacts of work from home on the environment. So in conclusion, at least while COVID-19 continues to affect travel behavior, policies supporting telework could not decrease pollutant emissions generated by working trips. However, they should be combined with strategies fostering the adoption of sustainable travel modes. Thank you for your attention.
Wilhelm? Okay, so audience, do you have any questions for Riccardo?
Hi. Sorry, I'm Hannah Yunus. I think that was a great presentation. I just had a remark, and maybe I missed it at some point, but throughout your presentation, you were talking about the environment. And I guess I would say it's important to specify that you're only looking at transportation related emissions and not overall emissions, because people are cooling their homes, heating their homes because they're working from home. They're not, and maybe in other ways, buildings may have like completely closed and those buildings are not getting heated and cooled anymore. So I initially thought that you were going to discuss like this overall impact, but either way, it's a great presentation. So thank you for that. Just a remark.
Oh, thank you for your compliments. Yes, this is a sort of limitation of the work, and there are a lot of other limitations. However, we focused only on impact related to transportation. As you said, there are many other potential impacts related to telework. As you said, many previous works have estimated, for instance, the impacts due to the buildings, the residential and office buildings, and also due to the adoption of information and communication technologies. And another limitation of this work is the focus on the rebound effect related to COVID-19 and not to other types of short or long-term rebound effects.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Yeah, so from my perspective, I think the telecommuting could be negatively influence the commuting. You know, thinking about if we have many people telecommute, and then the road is not congested, so that means the people, you know, they prefer to use automobile, and also because it's not congested, and then the attractiveness of the transit become less compared to the pre-COVID situation. And do you have any comments regarding this?
Yeah, sorry. It's a very complex topic. And yeah, I think that some negative impacts could be due to the pandemic, and in particular to the modal shift from public transportation to private car due to the perception of the health risk of traveling on public transportation. However, other factors could have caused this shift. For instance, the lower convenience of long-term public transportation subscriptions. For instance, the possibility of working from home for some few days a week could produce a low affordability of this kind of long-term subscriptions. I mean, if I can work for 2 or 3 days a week from my home, I could decide not to buy a long-term public transportation subscription, since it is not convenient to me. So this is another factor that could play a role in this case.
Yes, thank you. Any other questions from the audience?
Yes, I have a question, if I may.
Yeah, please.
I'm Brandon Irvine. I'm wondering. I know this might be a bit far afield for the scope of your paper, but if you have any thoughts on how the ongoing sort of negotiation between workers and their bosses affects this equation, because it's sort of my impression that some research I've seen on work from home has shown a sort of, there are different attitudes where the employers are wanting people to come in, and then some are, whereas on the other end, the employees are wanting to work from home. Right now, of course, this is just a U.S. perspective. While there was quite a bit of unemployment, and as it continues to be a fair amount of, while there was a fairly low unemployment, that gave, I think, some of the edge to the employees rather. But, I could see that going the other way as unemployment becomes worse for people, giving them effectively less negotiating power. Do you have any thoughts on that in general, or do I would understand if that feels too far from the scope of your paper, but I'm just kind of curious if you've given any thought to
that. We did not investigate this aspect. However, I think that this factor could play a significant role. And I can say that here in Italy, telework has been mandatory during the first national lockdown. After that, and now it is no longer mandatory. However, some firms, and in particular private firms, continue to give this possibility. However, just for a few days. And I think that it depends on the kind of work that you are carrying out. Maybe some types of jobs require more control from your boss. And for instance, here public administrations can work only 1 day, can work only 1 day from home.
Yeah, I think our experiences might be sort of congruent. Everything you just said, I think, applies to the U.S. as well. I don't know. I don't know if you have a sense just culturally whether you think Italian supervisors and more management layer tend to want people to come back and physically be in the office. I also see some good chat about agglomeration effects with economies too. I'd actually like to hear about that as well, if somebody wants to talk about that.
Yeah, I agree with you, but I think I can add that there could be another factor for public administration in particular. The relationship with the public is important. Therefore, even if some kind of tasks could be performed by home, here in Italy, public administration managers decide to delete, to forbidden work from home for many days for this reason.
Okay,
Right.
thank you very
Yeah.
much.
Oh, sorry, I didn't want to harp on that.
Yeah, thank you very much, Riccardo. And so given the time, and then I think we are going to shift to the next presentation. And so we can continue our conversation regarding the COVID-19 pandemic and the future telecommuting. And also, the next presentation is about the United States. It's more kind of the local, even though our audience are really global. And so our next speaker is Dr. Matt Bagat-Conway. And he is assistant professor in the Department of City and Regional Planning and Odom Institute for Research in Social Science at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And his research interests in travel behavior modeling, transport, land use interactions, and transport network analysis. He holds a doctorate degree in geography from Arizona State University. Welcome.
Thank you. All right, I think everyone should be able to see my screen now. So thanks for that introduction. So I'm going to talk about some work I did with some co-authors about looking at how the COVID-19 pandemic affected telecommuting during the pandemic, but more importantly, how we think it's going to affect telecommuting going forward in a US context. So fairly similar to the kind of research question of the previous survey, but I think with fairly different methods. So hopefully this provides kind of a good, well-rounded webinar series here. And so the first author on this is Deborah Salin, who's unfortunately not able to join us today, but I'm here to talk about what we did. And this project grew out of the COVID-19 and the Future survey, which was a large survey effort conducted by Arizona State University and the University of Illinois, Chicago, and then later on with some contributions from UNC Chapel Hill once I moved here. So we had a very large team working on the data collection, and then a smaller team working on the analysis for each of the kind of individual analyses coming out of this project. So the survey was a 3-wave panel survey we started data collection really in spring of 2020, but we redeployed with a larger sample and an improved survey instrument starting in summer of 2020. And we got about 9,000 respondents, mostly in the summer of 2020 to wave 1. Wave 2 took place in the fall of 2020 and the spring of 2021 and got about 3,000 responses, all of which those respondents are a subset of the original 9,000 respondents. And then in wave 3 took place in the fall of 2021 and also received about 3,000 responses, though not necessarily the same respondents as wave 2. We asked about a number of topics on this survey. So kind of classic survey stuff, demographics and employment, and then specific questions about attitudes and then behaviors around travel and around shopping and dining. And those kind of behavioral questions were really interesting because we asked respondents what they did before the pandemic, what they were doing now at the time of the survey during the pandemic. And then we asked them, importantly, about what they expected their lives would look like and what they would be doing after the pandemic. So how they would be getting to work, whether they would even be going to work, how much they would be, eating out, and so on. And that allows us to kind of start to make some predictions about the future that are based on what people actually have said they think is going to happen in their lives. So I think that that's a really kind of a valuable aspect of this survey. And this data set's public. You're welcome to download the data set, look at the survey, do your own analyses, check our analyses. We certainly encourage anyone to grab that data set from covidfuture.org. And so our respondents were distributed across the US with more responses in the larger states. And a particularly large pool of respondents in Arizona because of we used a couple of different methods for sampling, a purchase survey panel and a purchased email list, but we were also able to use a email list that we had purchased for a previous project within Arizona. And within that email address, we had, because of that, we had a very large number of responses from Arizona. Now we did use weighting to make the responses geographically and demographically representative of the United States as a whole. So starting to get into some of the kind of key findings of this research. So we found that before, during, and after the pandemic, most workers in the US were not able to telecommute. And during the pandemic, that was a small majority. But across all three periods, most workers don't have or don't expect to have the option to telecommute. And we think that has a lot to do with job types. So during the pandemic, really every business, for the most part in the US, was encouraging telecommuting for jobs where that was possible. But there are a lot of jobs, working in a grocery store or working at a frontline, emergency medical scenario, working in transportation, all kinds of jobs like that really are not possible through telecommuting, at least not yet. And then more than 20% of all workers expect to telecommute more in the post-pandemic period than they did pre-pandemic. And so that's a lot of that is folks who didn't telecommute at all prior to the pandemic, expecting to start telecommuting at least some of the time. But that's also some folks who already were telecommuting, but are expecting to telecommute more often than they did pre-pandemic. And more than 20% of workers in the US also had their first major telecommuting experience during the pandemic. So this is people who had never telecommuted before, or at least not regularly. Started telecommuting regularly during the pandemic, which gave them that kind of experience with telecommuting that they hadn't had in the past. And of those 20%, the vast majority of them, 80 to 90%, would like to continue to telecommute if their employers allow it. So that really just indicates the demand for workers for this kind of flexible work option. And particularly right now, workers have a lot of power in the employment marketplace in the US. The job market is tight. Wages are rising across sectors. So employers, in order to retain their workforce, have to provide perks, including increased wages, but also things that workers are looking for, like the ability to work from home. So I think it's likely that we're going to see employer policies kind of shifting as there's more worker demand for telecommuting. Most of the new telecommuters, so the folks who weren't telecommuting before the pandemic but expect to after, still expect to go into the office in person sometimes. So they're telecommuting a few days a week, more of a flexible work schedule than a full-time remote. But a substantial minority of those expect to telecommute every day. And in wave one, that was roughly 9% of those new telecommuters, going up to 20% in wave three. So that's kind of an increasing trend. People are more likely to think, as the kind of lockdowns have worn on and as people have had more experience with remote work, they're more likely to expect that they're going to be able to and want to and choose to telecommute every day in the kind of post-pandemic world. And I think probably one of the most interesting findings of this study is that the new telecommuters are really quite demographically similar to the folks who were already telecommuting before the pandemic. So there's a lot of folks who are telecommuting now who weren't previously, but this hasn't represented a big demographic shift in who's able to telecommute. So when we look at educational attainment, this first row here is folks who were telecommuting before COVID happened. And the majority of them have a college degree, about a third have a graduate degree. And new telecommuters are almost identical in terms of their educational kind of attainment distribution. Whereas those who never telecommuted, so didn't telecommute before the pandemic, during the pandemic, or expect to after, 80% of those don't have a college degree. And so that has, I think, a lot to do with the types of jobs those folks have. But we're not seeing kind of a democratization of telecommuting in the way, some might have hoped. Similarly, with income, telecommuters before the pandemic were disproportionately high income, with 60% coming from households that earn over $100,000 a year. Among the new telecommuters, that's almost the same. Slightly smaller proportions from those households earning over $100,000 a year, but actually smaller proportions from those under $50,000 a year households as well. Whereas for those who never telecommuted in any of the periods, that's about an even split among these three income categories. So the kind of the median income among folks who telecommuted either before COVID or who are starting to telecommute are high, and expect to, don't expect a lot of change in that. Similarly with age, telecommuters both before the pandemic and those who expect to start telecommuting are older than the folks who didn't have the option to telecommute. Further along in their careers, that may mean that they're in more, managerial roles or something like that. But again, that age distribution hasn't changed a whole lot due to the pandemic. And race ethnicity, we see some slight differences with a larger proportion of the new telecommuters coming from the Black or African American race in the United States. But again, it's still, we don't see a whole huge change. And then Hispanics are overrepresented among those who, never had the option to telecommute. So those are all bivariate analyses of who's telecommuting and seeing kind of the demographic shifts, or more accurately, the lack thereof. But we also wanted to do a multivariate model to understand kind of how these factors influence the telecommuting decision in a multivariate sense. And so to model telecommute propensity, it's a little bit tricky because we kind of theorize that telecommuting is resulting from two related but distinct processes. And one is whether an employer is allowing their employee to telecommute. And that's, an effect of those employer policies, which are policies put in place by the employer, but are also influenced to some degree by the employee, depending on, how much market power the employees have to kind of set the terms of their work environment. And then, given that an employer allows their employees to telecommute, it's relatively rare for employers to force their employees to telecommute. Most places give an option to telecommute or not. So then there's also a decision for the worker of how often to choose to telecommute, if at all. So these are, we think, two separate processes that have somewhat different determinants in terms of how those decisions are made. And the challenge with modeling them separately, and particularly with modeling telecommuting frequency, is that we only observe the telecommuting frequency for the workers who are allowed to telecommute. We don't have any information on how often the workers who are not allowed to telecommute would telecommute if they had the option to do so. And so the workers who are allowed to telecommute are almost certainly, we know from the previous slides, a biased sample of all the workers. And there are probably some shared unobserved factors that contribute to both having the option to telecommute and telecommuting frequency. So that could be things like, very fine-grained details of the type of work you do beyond our kind of like broad industry categories that we have in our survey. Or it could have to do with the amount of experience you have on the job, and that contributes to trust from your supervisor that you'll be able to be productive at home. All kinds of things like that. And the problem with those shared unobserved factors is that those shared unobserved factors could result in a biased coefficient estimation in the model of telecommuting frequency, because we are sampling a population that is above or below average in terms of those shared unobserved factors. So that creates an emitted variable bias problem. If you have studied econometrics, probably the obvious solution to this problem is a Heckman model, which uses a binary probit to estimate the, in this case, the propensity or probability of having the option to telecommute, and then uses the error term from that model as a correction for those emitted variables. So basically as a proxy variable for those emitted variables, and that removes the bias. I'm happy to talk about the math of that if you want to, but I'm not going to spend the time doing that now. The challenge with using a Heckman correction here is that the Heckman correction only applies to an ordinary least squares second stage model, and our frequency variable is actually discretized because of how the survey was asked. But you can do something very similar with a discrete model. So we jointly estimate that binary probit model of the ability, just like you would in a Heckman model. And then we jointly estimate that with a multinomial probit model of the frequency of telecommuting, and allow those to have a shared multivariate normal error term that can be correlated. So we can model that correlation between the error terms of those two models. And we can model that as a conditional mixed process model using the CMP user written package in Stata. And this is kind of our conceptual model of these two telecommuting decisions. And you'll notice that a lot of these variables that we think affect ability to telecommute or telecommuting frequency, we think really only affect one or the other. Like we think education level primarily affects the ability to telecommute by affecting what kind of a job you have, what you do, how much trust there is, and how much market power you have as an employee to gain the ability to telecommute. Whereas telecommuting frequency, we think, is more determined by things like whether you enjoy telecommuting, demographic factors like whether you have kids at home and whether your home environment itself is conducive to work, whether your commute is a major disutility to going into the office. And we think that a lot of these factors are largely separate. And the ones that are in the grayed out boxes here are things that we don't actually observe in our survey. So those are potentially some of those shared unobserved factors. And you can see some of those do affect both of these outcomes in our kind of conceptual model here. So the key results from this modeling exercise in terms of the determinants of ability to telecommute. So we still have separate models and separate sets of coefficients for each of these kind of related decisions. We just have allowed them to have a shared error term. So in terms of the determinants of ability to telecommute, highly educated workers are more likely to have the ability or be allowed to telecommute. Frontline workers are less likely to do so, which makes sense. A lot of those jobs, then that was a pretty broad category in our survey, but that could be anything from emergency medical services to truck drivers to grocery store workers. But primarily those consist of jobs where you can't do them remotely. So those are folks who were working from home not working from home before the pandemic. And mostly those are the folks who continued to be unable to work from home during the pandemic. Those are the folks who had to go to work regardless, potentially, exposing themselves to the virus more so, and then expect to continue to not be able to work from home after the pandemic. Professionals across all periods are more likely to be able to telecommute. And education workers were kind of interesting because before and after the pandemic, they were more likely to be able, or less likely to be able to telecommute, I should say, which makes sense because we're, in the classroom teaching. During the pandemic, though, they were more likely to be able to telecommute because school largely moved online during the pandemic. In our set of coefficients for telecommuting frequency, things like enjoying telecommuting and age were significant in choosing to telecommute more often. Somewhat surprisingly to us, things about attributes of the home, so whether you had a spare bedroom, whether you had high-speed internet service at your home, didn't wind up being significant in our model, and neither did controls for region of the US, which we thought would be significant because different regions reopened quicker or slower than others and had different experiences with the pandemic era policies. And then frontline workers were interesting in that among those who, for frontline workers, given that they have the ability to telecommute, which is a small subset of all frontline workers, they're more likely to telecommute sometimes, but less likely to telecommute all the time, which given their job duties makes sense that maybe, there's some paperwork or something they can do from home, but they do need to be in the workplace at some times. The most interesting thing from this model is we fit the model 3 times in each of the time periods. And between the pre-pandemic and post-pandemic periods, the correlates of ability and frequency are remarkably stable. There's more differences during the pandemic, and I'm not really going to highlight those here in the kind of the slides I showed just before, really focused on the pre and post-pandemic results. But the main exceptions to these pre and post-pandemic determinants being roughly the same is that professional and administrative workers are more likely to have the ability to telecommute post-pandemic, and full-time workers previously were less likely to telecommute frequently. That's no longer the case post-pandemic. But for the most part, this kind of confirms what we saw in the bivariate results, that the folks who are able to telecommute after the pandemic are very similar to those who were able to telecommute before. We're not seeing a big change or a democratization in who is able to telecommute. So in conclusion, we can expect kind of a long-term increase in telecommuting in the US. I think that's quite clear from our study and from many others. But we shouldn't expect a whole lot to change in terms of who is able to telecommute and what those attributes of telecommuters are. In terms of social equity, education, job type, and income, we found were stronger predictors of telecommuting ability than things like race, ethnicity, or gender. That said, looking at bivariate analyses is still very important for equity considerations. And people who are unable to telecommute during the pandemic were disproportionately lower income with lower levels of education and Hispanic. Similarly, post-pandemic, there are differences in telecommuting ability by race, ethnicity, and gender of a few percentage points, but those differences are relatively stable from pre-pandemic. So again, the pandemic hasn't really changed who's able to telecommute, but it also hasn't made those disparities worse. And then in terms of the transport implications, very briefly, just a very simple analysis would suggest that telecommuting would initially reduce commute VMT by 10 to 20%, just in terms of the number of commutes that are no longer occurring. But rebound effects are likely and not something we really can get into with our data due to increased non-work trips. So folks who were previously, stopping at the grocery store on the way home from work still need to go to the grocery store. And people also may change their residential location. And just anecdotally, a number of my coworkers have made changes to their residential locations because they, now only need to come into the office twice a week. So they're traveling further and maybe by a different mode than they were before when they had to make that trip every day. So in summary, telecommuting is likely to stick around post-pandemic with various implications for society, but the demographics of who's telecommuting haven't actually changed that much. And I guess we probably have a few minutes for questions, and I'm also happy if you want to reach out to me via email. I'm happy to have a longer conversation with you. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. This is a very insightful presentation. And if you see the chat box, actually there are already 2 questions there. And one question is regarding the education and the professional class. And so do you think they are kind of highly correlated with each other in your case?
I think for the very strongly correlated anyways. So our job categories didn't really match the ones that are used in a lot of other surveys. And the reason for that was we wanted to really separate out during the pandemic which people actually had the ability to telecommute. So that was kind of what we based our job categories on. But I do think that those professional and education classes mostly cover the white collar workforce. And similarly for the correction for childcare and family care issues, I believe we did include a variable for whether there were children in the household. I'd have to look back at the paper to see what the effects of that were. But beyond that, we didn't have any particular correction for that. Let me see. Then I've got one other kind of clarifying question. Sorry, I didn't see this during the chat about the 9% of whether that 9% was relative to the entire wave 1 or only the subset. It was relative to the entire wave 1, but there are weights in both waves to make the populations demographically similar across, and all of the descriptive statistics were weighted.
And also, I think the correction for the child care and family care issue, this one, in the long term, this may not be an issue because of the COVID situation. And then we have the kids stay at home and also some people sick. So that means, they will be kind of a very important factor for people's decision to telecommute or not. But over the long term, this could be a case, but it's not going to be a significant influence in our decision. So that's just my guess. And do we have any other questions from the audience? And feel free to unmute yourself. But also, I think I want to follow just kind of the previous conversation. I think the employer's policy could have a very important influence on people's decision, what to do. Apparently in your model, you didn't model this, as just kind of as a latent, maybe, try to correct this bias. And so maybe can you just elaborate how the employment policies could be a facilitator or could hinder the adoption of the telecommuting in the long run?
Well, I think we don't have any variables describing the employer policy, but we did ask folks what their expectation was. And I think that folks have and we did ask specifically whether they expect that their employer will allow them to telecommute. And I think folks have a pretty good idea. I think, folks have either their employers had announced policies at the time of this survey, or they at least had some feeling on how this was going to go. Or I think there's a significant number of folks who changed jobs specifically to have the ability to telecommute long term. I think that, certainly employers do have some influence here, particularly if the labor market gets, particularly if unemployment goes up and people are more desperate to find jobs. And I think that there are other folks who have surveyed employers and largely found work from home as, a positive or neutral in terms of productivity. But I think if there were kind of like a large scale shift in how employers were thinking about telecommuting or how much power workers had to influence the decision, then you could see a different outcome.
I think sometimes could be a business decision. If the business see the downturn of their performance, and then they may use telecommuting as a scapegoat. Right, so this is one potential reason. Also, I'm thinking about the university setting. Currently, we do have a lot of ability to telecommute, and even for the students, we see a lot of kind of the previously this group meeting, conducted in person, but currently it's more by online. But the cost is, we don't see that kind of engaging environment on campus. So I think this could be a similar situation at the office setting. If we have the business, and then for the old workers, that's okay because they know everybody, they know the organization. But for the newer employees, they just come the stranger, to the company. I think that could change the culture of could change the attitudes of the employer.
Well, and I think that a really critical thing is that there were not that many folks who expected to be working from home every day. I think that that's certainly going to grow, but I think where we're going to see much more growth is the people who are coming to the office 2 or 3 days a week instead of 5 days a week. And I think that helps kind of with the concern you just raised about folks, seeing each other in the office.
Any additional question? Yep.
Hi, Matt. It's a very interesting research. I have a question regarding to the level of research which you conducted. I believe you conduct your research at the individual level. I wonder if you have any cases about how decision making at the household level will in fact in return affect individuals' telecommuting behavior. For example, maybe today I decided to take all the kids to kindergarten or whatever, and maybe my partner decide to go to telecommute. Is there any possibility to explain any cases or evidence suggesting that household decision-making process might be a predictor for telecommuting behaviors?
I think for the most part, not with our data. We don't have, we didn't specifically try to survey multiple members from a single household. I think there might be a few cases where that happened by chance, but certainly not enough to do any formal analysis of. We do know something about the family structure and household structure and whether, other adults in the household are employed, things like that. And we controlled for some of that in this model. I certainly think there's more we could do in terms of controlling for household structure. But in terms of kind of controlling for kind of modeling that specific within household decision making, we didn't really do that. But I do think that's, really relevant. Even speaking from my own experience, that has been a big part of, my wife and I's residential location choices and things like that.
Okay. Thank you, Matt. Very informative.
Okay, thank you very much. And also, I think Michael Econo just raised comments in the chat box. It says, you know, the experiential evidence generated in the next couple of years will be very important. Right. So I think I agree with this opinion. And so I think this is going to be a ongoing conversation for the next several years. So for that reason, you know, we think this topic is very important. And so we are organizing another telecommuting session in February of 2023. So we will have two speakers, and one is Hannah Eunice from Rutgers, and also Xinyi Qian from University of Minnesota. And so they will talk about their research on the telecommuting. And then if you want to know more about this one, and then please become a friend of the AMS 50. So in that case, you can get the information regarding the access and also the exact date. Thank you very much, everybody. And thank you, Matt and Riccardo, for your wonderful presentation. Hopefully we can see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.